Hello constant readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to season 2 of the Dark Tower reading project. Today we're going to be talking about adaptation. Alright, so as we end this project, I want to talk a little bit about filmic adaptation before we watch the movie and I react to it. There was a 2017 adaptation of the Dark Tower series. It wasn't well received, shall we say. I haven't watched it, I haven't watched any trailers for it, I have managed to completely isolate myself from the Dark Tower film, but the general, murmur, I guess, about it on the internet is that it was not good. I want to talk about adaptation and what makes a successful adaptation, just so that we're kind of on the same page before we go into looking at the 2017 adaptation of The Dark Tower. Adaptation is defined as the transfer of a work or story in whole or in part to a feature film. So Robert Stam is a professor at New York University. He teaches about French New Wave filmmakers and has generally published on French literature, comparative literature, film topics, etc. Thinks of filmic adaptation as a dialogic process. What does that mean? I didn't know. So dialogic as a concept comes from some guy named Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin was a 20th century Russian philosopher who talked about this dialogic process in his work of literary theory called The Dialogic Imagination. T.S. Eliot, one of the 20th century poets whose name you should remember from season 1 of the Dark Tower series, he wrote The Wasteland. We chatted a lot about that in the episode I will link up here. Sums up the dialogic nicely as follows, quote, "The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past." So, what we need to remember is that the source material and the adaptation are always talking to each other. And our understanding of one shapes our understanding of the other. But we have to remember, my favorite, Mr. Roland Barthes, meaning doesn't transfer directly from the writer to the reader. Remember Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, don't care about what the author intends. What we care about, what Barthes cares about, what I care about, is what is textually present. And the meaning of the text is produced by the reader in relation to the text. So it's our baggage we bring to the text that brings meaning. And I have talked about intertextuality in an earlier episode in season 2, which I will link above. So folks involved in adapting a film experience this same mediation. Say I want to make an adaptation of my favorite children's fantasy novel, Protector of the Small by Tamora Pierce. I don't have access to the inside of Tamora Pierce's head. I have access to the text, and how I read the text is how I write the script, how I envision the setting, how I cast the characters, right? It is the text that stands as a link between the author, Tamora Pierce, and me, the reader. And how I interpret it is entirely based on my engagement with the words that I've been given. So here's the question. Why don't we make literal adaptations? There are so many times, and I can say this myself, having grown up reading the Harry Potter series and then watching the films and being so disappointed, I think especially with the 4th film, where the book was massive and the movie just took all of the exciting parts and jammed it together with none of the character building stuff, right? Why don't they make literal adaptations? Well, that's been tried. In 1924, a human called Erich von Stroheim attempted a literal adaptation of book to film. The product was 9.5 hours long, and he was forced to cut it down to 4 hours because they were like, dude, nobody is sitting in a theater to watch a 9.5 hour film. You need to edit this down. And he was like, well, it doesn't make sense if I take out all these things. So 4 hours. 4 hours is the best I can do. The theater showing it made even further cuts so that the film was down to a watchable 2-hour film. And at that point, the story that was left was largely incoherent. Very few people have tried a literal book to film adaptation since then. We just have to make adaptations to tell the same story, to get the same meaning across to a new audience. We don't have to use the same words, we don't have to use the same dialogue, we don't have to use the same settings, but we have to transfer the same ideas, the same vibes, the same meanings across. So what makes a bad adaptation? We know that cutting things down is important for making something watchable. We can't include all of the things in a book on screen. It's just not possible in terms of time, and oftentimes things that work well in writing don't translate well to screen. But we also can't cut the story down and remove too many pieces so that the story doesn't make sense to somebody who hasn't read the source material, which is why I think Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is a bad adaptation. There are so many large jumps in logic that if you haven't read the story, you probably left not really sure what you watched, right? Like, I can remember watching the film with my dad who hadn't read the books. Things would just happen and we would be like, oh, this is the context, and we would fill it in with stuff from the book for him because the film was absolute nonsense without the context of the source material. That is a bad adaptation. Therefore, a good adaptation should stand alone, in my opinion. You shouldn't have to be an informed viewer filling in the gaps in the filmic narration to understand the story that you're watching. So a good adaptation should capture the feeling and the meaning of a story. It wants to include all of the best scenes and all of the best characters. And I think as a book lover, I often watch a film and I'm like, oh, they took out my favorite scene. Like, I loved that scene. They got rid of it. But sometimes I think, especially now having looked at what makes a good adaptation, I think a lot of those scenes are important to take out. If it's messing with the pacing of the story, if it slows down the pacing, slows down the plot, brings the plot to a halt, I think sometimes scenes need to go. And as a book lover who has some favorite scenes that have been cut out of movies, I can see the value in translating a story into a different medium and keeping the feeling and the meaning forefront over little side bits that I might find amusing. So I'm curious moving forward to experience the 2017 filmic adaptation of The Dark Tower to see if it is successful as an adaptation in terms of the sort of rules for successful adaptation that I've discussed here today. Like, just because something is successful doesn't mean that longtime fans of the series will like it, right? So I'm curious how the Dark Tower film does in terms of adaptation. Is it a successful standalone? That will remain to be seen. Of course, we will be talking about the film after I've watched it. Let's talk about what, in your opinion, makes a successful adaptation. Do you agree with this sort of research from the film critics, film scholars? Do you think there are other key elements that make something a successful filmic adaptation? Before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this and other long-form projects possible. I really appreciate the work that you are enabling me to do. If you are interested in supporting the series, in saying thank you, in tipping me for the amount of work that has gone into this series, the link to my Patreon page will be in the description box down below. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, long days and pleasant nights.